One sentence from a 12-year-old boy made Steve Harvey drop his microphone mid-show. Not because of what the kid said, because of what he'd been carrying alone for 8 months. The cameras kept rolling, but this stopped being a game show the moment Daniel whispered those 6 words that broke everyone in that studio. What happened next? Nobody, not even the producers, saw it coming. Let me take you back to how we got here. Because before those 6 words changed everything, there was a boy who remembered too much. It was a Thursday morning at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. Steve Harvey walked in at his usual time, coffee in hand, reviewing the day's contestant families. The Henderson family from Sacramento was scheduled for the 2 p.m. taping. Standard suburban family, the production note said, parents, 2 biological kids, and 1 foster child. Steve had seen hundreds of families like this, or so he thought. What the production notes didn't mention was that 12-year-old Daniel Martinez had a gift most people would call a blessing, but he experienced as a curse: photographic memory, total recall. He remembered everything, every face, every word, every moment. And when you've lived Daniel's life, remembering everything isn't a superpower, it's a prison. Daniel had been in the foster care system since he was 4 years old. 8 years, 17 different homes. He could tell you the address of every single one. He could describe the wallpaper in bedroom number 3, the crack in the ceiling of house number 9, the smell of cigarette smoke that clung to the curtains in placement number 14. But what Daniel remembered most clearly were the reasons. Too emotional, too needy, too expensive, too much work. The words foster parents used when they called his caseworker to ask for his removal. Daniel remembered all of them, filed away in his mind like case files he couldn't delete. The Henderson family had taken Daniel in 8 months ago. 8 months, 4 days, and roughly 6 hours to be exact. It was already the longest placement of his life. Robert and Susan Henderson were different from the others. Daniel had learned not to hope, but something about them made him want to try. Maybe it was how Susan always made sure his favorite cereal was stocked, even though nobody asked him what his favorite cereal was. Maybe it was how Robert showed up to every single one of his school events, even the boring ones. Or maybe it was how they'd been talking about adoption. Daniel had overheard them 3 months ago. Late-night conversation through the heating vent in his bedroom: adoption, permanent, forever. Words that made his heart race in a way he didn't trust, because Daniel had learned something in 17 homes. Forever is a lie, adults tell children. But he wanted to believe them. God, he wanted to believe them so badly it physically hurt. The Family Feud invitation had come 6 months earlier, when the Hendersons first applied. It was supposed to be a celebration, a family adventure. By the time the taping date arrived, it had become something else entirely for Daniel. It had become the day he was memorizing. Because 1 week ago, Daniel had overheard another conversation. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He'd come downstairs for water and heard their voices in the kitchen, sharp, stressed. The kind of tone he recognized from every home before this one, the tone that came before the caseworker's phone call. Robert's voice: "We can't afford this." Susan's voice: "We'll figure it out. We always do." Robert's voice: "But what if we can't? What if this is a mistake?" Daniel had frozen on the stairs. He knew that word. Mistake. He'd been called a mistake before. He'd been the financial burden that 17 families decided wasn't worth it. He'd walked back upstairs, climbed into bed, and started the process he'd perfected over 8 years: memorization. Because if they were going to give him up, if this family was going to be like all the others, he wanted to remember what it felt like to almost belong. He memorized the way Susan hummed while making breakfast, the exact shade of blue in Robert's favorite shirt, the sound of his foster siblings laughing at dinner. He cataloged every detail of this house, this family, this life, so that years from now, when he was older and harder and more broken, he could close his eyes and remember the last time he was happy. The Family Feud taping was today. Tomorrow was their scheduled court date for the adoption hearing. Daniel knew because he'd seen the papers on Susan's desk. But after what he'd overheard, he also knew that court date would probably be a cancellation appointment instead. So he decided to make today perfect. One perfect memory to carry with him to placement number 18. Standing backstage at Family Feud, Daniel studied everything: the temperature of the room, the specific sound of the audience warming up, the way stage lights created shadows in the corners. He was building a memory palace, storing every sensation. Steve Harvey walked past during the family meet and greet, and Daniel memorized him too. The exact pattern of his suit. The warmth in his eyes that looked genuine, not performed. The way he smelled like expensive cologne and peppermint. When Steve knelt down to Daniel's level for the introduction, Daniel noticed something he'd gotten very good at noticing. Steve Harvey was actually looking at him. Not through him, not past him, at him. "And who's this young man?" Steve asked, his voice carrying that signature warmth. "Daniel," he said quietly. "I'm 12. "Daniel, my man, you excited to be here?" Daniel wanted to say yes, wanted to play along with the game show energy. Instead, the truth slipped out before he could stop it. "I'm trying to remember everything." Steve's smile faltered. "For just a second. Remember everything? Why's that, young man?" Daniel looked at Robert and Susan standing nearby. They were smiling, excited, completely unaware that he knew, that he'd heard, that he was preparing for goodbye. "Because," Daniel said carefully, "you should always remember the good days." Something flickered across Steve Harvey's face. He held Daniel's gaze for a moment longer than expected, then stood and moved to the next family member. But Daniel noticed Steve glance back at him twice during the rest of the introductions. He filed that away too, the way Steve Harvey looked at him like he was trying to solve a puzzle. The game started normally enough. The Henderson family was playing against the Rodriguez family from Texas, and the energy was exactly what you'd expect from Family Feud. Competitive, loud, fun. Daniel's foster siblings were excited, high-fiving after every answer. Robert and Susan were laughing, relaxed, looking like the perfect American family. Daniel played his part perfectly. He smiled at the right moments. He cheered when they got answers on the board. He was performing the role of happy foster kid, a character he'd perfected across 17 homes. But Steve Harvey kept watching him. It was subtle. Between questions during commercial breaks, while walking from one podium to another, Steve's eyes kept finding Daniel, studying him with an intensity that made Daniel uncomfortable because it felt like Steve was seeing through the performance. By the third round, the Henderson family was ahead. They were playing well, might actually win the $20,000. Daniel should have been excited. Instead, he was calculating $20,000 was a lot of money, maybe enough to make keeping him worth it, maybe enough to change Robert's mind about the cost. The thought made him feel sick, like he was a transaction instead of a person. The question came up, name something every family needs to survive. Susan hit the buzzer first. "Love," she answered confidently. The audience awed. The answer was on the board. Number 2. Steve walked over to Daniel, who was at the end of the family line. "Daniel, my man, your family's doing good? You having fun?" Daniel nodded, maintaining his smile. "What about you?" Steve asked, going off script. "What do you think every family needs to survive?" It was a casual question, conversational banter to fill time, but something about the way Steve asked it, the genuine curiosity in his eyes, made Daniel's carefully constructed walls crack. "Trust," Daniel whispered. The word came out before he could stop it, raw, honest, loaded with 8 years of broken promises. Steve's expression shifted. "Trust," he repeated slowly. "That's a good answer, young man. That's a real good answer." The game continued, but Steve's attention on Daniel intensified. During the next commercial break, Daniel saw Steve talking to the producers, gesturing toward him. He felt panic rising. Had he said something wrong? Were they going to cut the family from the show? Would that be his fault too? They made it to fast money. The Henderson family had won. Robert and Susan would answer questions to try to reach 200 points and win the cash prize. Daniel should have been celebrating with his foster siblings. Instead, he was watching Robert's face, trying to read whether winning money would be enough. Susan went first, scored 142 points. Solid. Robert needed 58 more points to win. But then Steve did something unexpected. He walked over to Daniel. "Hold up," Steve said to the producers. "Before we do the second round, I need to ask Daniel something." The studio went quiet. This wasn't part of the format. Contestants' family members didn't participate in fast money. But Steve Harvey had spent 30 years in entertainment learning to trust his instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something was wrong with this kid. Daniel, Steve said, kneeling down to his eye level in the middle of the stage. Come here for a second, young man. Daniel walked over slowly, confused. The audience was silent, sensing something unplanned unfolding. I want you to answer this last question instead of your pops, Steve said. That okay with everybody? Robert and Susan looked surprised but nodded immediately. Of course, Susan said. Steve focused entirely on Daniel. Here's the question, and I want you to answer honestly. Not what you think should be on the board. What you really think. Can you do that? Daniel nodded. Name something, Steve said carefully, that you want more than anything in the world. The question hung in the air. It wasn't a Family Feud question. It wasn't pulled from any survey. This was Steve Harvey asking a 12-year-old boy to tell the truth. Daniel's throat tightened. He looked at Robert and Susan standing at the podium, at his foster siblings watching from the side, at the cameras capturing everything. At this moment he was supposed to be memorizing, and suddenly he was so tired of memorizing, so tired of preparing for goodbye, so tired of being brave, so tired of pretending he didn't want what every kid wants. I want. Daniel started, his voice cracking. I want to stop remembering everything. Steve's expression shifted to something deeper than television, compassion. What do you mean, son? The dam broke, 8 years of holding everything in, and Daniel couldn't anymore. I have photographic memory, he said, tears streaming down his face now. I remember everything, every house I've lived in, every family that gave me back, all 17 of them. I remember exactly what they said about why I was too much trouble. The studio was dead silent. And I've been trying so hard to remember this family, Daniel continued. The words pouring out now, because last week I heard them. I heard Robert say they can't afford this, that maybe I'm a mistake. And tomorrow is supposed to be adoption day, but I know they're going to cancel it because I'm too expensive, and I just wanted to remember what it felt like before they give me back. The audience gasped. Susan's hand flew to her mouth. Robert's face went pale. Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of hours of television, stood there frozen. So I've been memorizing everything about today, Daniel finished, his voice barely a whisper, because I want to remember the last time I was happy. Time stopped. Steve Harvey looked at this 12-year-old boy, who'd been carrying the weight of 17 rejections, who'd spent a week preparing to have his heart broken again, who just confessed his deepest fear on national television. Then Steve looked at Robert and Susan, whose faces showed absolute devastation. Hold up, Steve said, his voice thick. Hold up just a minute. He walked over to Robert and Susan. Is what he's saying true? You planning on canceling the adoption? No, Susan practically shouted. God, no, Daniel, no. Robert was already moving toward Daniel, but Steve stopped him with a raised hand. Wait. Let him hear this from where he is. Let him remember this exactly as it happens. Robert's voice carried across the studio. Daniel, we were arguing about money, but not about you, never about you. We were arguing about who should take extra shifts at work to pay for the adoption fees. I wanted Susan to keep her hours because she's been tired. She wanted me to keep mine because I've been stressed. We were fighting about how to afford keeping you, not about whether we wanted to. Susan was crying now. Baby, you're not too expensive. You're priceless. We've been saving for months to pay the adoption fees. We've been planning for months to pay the adoption fees. We've been working extra hours because you're worth every single second. Daniel stood there, 12 years old, processing information that contradicted 8 years of learned fear. Steve Harvey made a decision that would define not just this episode, but the reason he was put on that stage in the first place. He walked over to Daniel and put both hands on the boy's shoulders. Daniel, look at me, son. Steve's voice was gentle but firm. You've been remembering all the wrong things. You've been remembering every goodbye, but you haven't been letting yourself remember what it feels like when somebody fights to keep you. He turned to address the entire studio. This young man has been carrying a burden no child should carry, and tomorrow he was going to walk into that courtroom thinking he was going to be rejected for the 18th time. Steve pulled out his phone, a move that broke every game show rule in existence. What's your caseworker's number? 10 minutes later, the judge scheduled to preside over tomorrow's adoption hearing was on speakerphone, patched through the studio's sound system. Judge Morrison, Steve said, I have a family here who needs some help. Daniel Martinez and Robert and Susan Henderson. They have an adoption hearing scheduled for tomorrow, but I'm wondering if you might be able to do something for us today. Today? The judge's voice came through the speakers. Mr. Harvey, adoption proceedings require. I know what they require, Your Honor. But this boy has spent 8 years being temporary, and he spent the last week thinking the family that loves him is going to give him up. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a man who recognizes when something can't wait. Is there any way, any possible way you can finalize this adoption right now? Over this phone in this studio, so this child can stop memorizing goodbyes and start remembering what home feels like. Silence on the phone. Then, put the family on. What happened next was unprecedented in television history. Over speakerphone, with 300 studio audience members as witnesses, with cameras capturing every second, Judge Morrison conducted an emergency adoption hearing. The questions were asked. The consent was given. Robert and Susan's voices shaking with emotion as they affirmed their commitment, and then the words that changed everything. By the power vested in me, by the state of California, I hereby grant this petition for adoption. Daniel Martinez, you are now legally and permanently Daniel Martinez Henderson. You have a family forever. The studio erupted. But Daniel stood frozen, processing forever. The word he'd learned not to trust. The lie adults tell children. Except this time it wasn't a lie. Steve knelt down one more time. Daniel, you hear that? You're not going to placement 18. You're not going anywhere. You're home. But the money, Daniel whispered. The adoption fees. Covered, Steve said. My foundation is covering all of it. Every single fee. Your parents aren't going to work extra shifts. They're going to spend that time with you. Making new memories, the kind you don't have to store up because you're scared they'll end. The kind that keep happening day after day because you're not going anywhere. Daniel looked at Robert and Susan, who were crying, arms outstretched. He looked at his siblings, his permanent siblings, cheering for him. He looked at 300 strangers who were all on their feet applauding. And for the first time in 8 years, Daniel let himself forget the 17 goodbyes, forget the walls he'd built, forget the fear that had been his constant companion. He ran to Robert and Susan, and they wrapped him in their arms, and Daniel cried, not the silent crying he'd perfected, but the loud, ugly, cathartic crying of a child who'd been holding everything in for far too long. Steve Harvey stood there watching, his own face wet with tears, and he understood something profound. This was why he was here. Not to host a game show, not to be funny or entertaining, but to be present for the moments when God decides to show up and rewrite a story that seemed already written. The episode never aired in its original form. Instead, it became a special presentation about foster care, adoption, and the power of permanency. It raised over $5 million for foster care organizations nationwide. Daniel is now 16. He still has photographic memory, but these days, what he remembers most clearly isn't the 17 houses where he didn't belong. It's the moment Steve Harvey asked him what he wanted most in the world. It's the sound of Judge Morrison's voice saying forever. It's the feeling of his dad's arms around him when the word son stopped being temporary. He still memorizes things, but now he memorizes the good stuff because it's going to keep happening, not because he's afraid it will end. Steve Harvey keeps a photo in his dressing room. Daniel, Robert, and Susan on that stage. The moment the adoption was finalized, he looks at it before every show, a reminder of why some moments matter more than entertainment. Because sometimes a 12-year-old boy carrying the weight of 17 goodbyes teaches a television studio full of adults what it means to be brave enough to hope again. Sometimes breaking every rule is exactly what's needed to follow the only rule that matters: show up for people when it counts. And sometimes the thing you're most afraid of losing is the thing that was fighting the hardest to keep you all along. Daniel doesn't have to remember everything anymore. He just has to remember he's home.